Introduction. Chapter I. What is philosophy? 1. The subject matter and nature of philosophical knowledge. On the etymology of the term philosophy. Etymologically, the word philosophy means love for Sophia, which is often translated, very approximately, as love for wisdom. In actual fact, the Old Greek concept of Sophia is much more complex and comprehensive than just wisdom. The fact is that Plato, who made the term philosophy part and parcel of the European terminology, did not see Sophia as an acquired subjective human property but a great objective quality, becoming only to a deity, inherent in a reasonably ordered and harmonious world. Because of his innate mortality and cognitive inadequacy, man could not, in Plato's view, really merge with Sophia. He could only love it, respectfully and at distance. That was the precise meaning that Plato attached to the word philosophy, and that is why it would be more correct to translate it as love for the truth. Although this is not quite exact either. Thus at its very inception philosophy was not conceived of as a mere collection of truths, but as a desire for the truth, as an ideal attitude of man's soul and mind, that can lead to a harmonious equilibrium between both his inner psychical life and his complex relationships with the world. Philosophy is, as it were, a guardian and indicator of the truth, one that is embedded in the soul of man himself, and does not permit him to bow down before some partial or subjectively attractive knowledge, constantly reminding man of the need to correlate his actions and opinions with some deeper truth about himself and the world. Taking a bit of metaphorical liberty, philosophy can be said to personify a collective expression of man's faith in the meaningfulness of his existence, in the existence of a higher truth, and at the same time in man's exceptional predestination revealed in his craving for this truth. For reasonable and purposive activity, it was precisely the emergence of philosophy, as distinct from the mythological world perception, that asserted in mankind's spiritual culture a reflective, reflecto I turn back, I reflect, rather than immediate empirical attitude to the environment, to man himself, and to man's thought. It was philosophy that created the intellectual background and style of thought which asserted, as it were, man's special position in the world and his consequent responsibility to himself and the world. The great semantic diversity and spiritual wealth brought by the history of culture in the past 2.5 millennia have largely changed the inner content of philosophy and the outer forms of its expression. At the same time it has remained a special type of thought, which does not strive for a utilitarian pragmatic or purely rational knowledge, which does not identify itself with usefulness, truth or wisdom, but ensures the tenor of man's soul and mind, which underlies what is known as the philosophical attitude to life. Now, wherein lies the specificity of the subject matter of philosophy, as distinct from all the other forms of social consciousness? The subject matter of philosophy. Before attempting to clarify the relationship between philosophy and other forms of social consciousness, science in particular, we should try to define, if only tentatively, the subject matter of philosophy as such, outside any reference to the other aspects of man's intellectual activity. After all, we do not begin the study of, say, physics with its relationship with philosophy. First, we try to define the specificity of the subject matter and method of physical knowledge, and only after this is done, is it natural to study the connections between this knowledge and philosophical problems. Philosophy is an area of intellectual activity which is based both on the special type of thought, which underlies philosophical knowledge, which we have already discussed in part, and on the autonomy of its subject matter. Interestingly, the specificity of the philosophical type of thought has practically never been doubted. Even the opponents of philosophy recognize that it is based on a type of thought all its own, of which they are intensely critical. But that is another question, though the existence of an object of cognition characteristic only of philosophy has been, and still is, questioned by many researchers, especially those who raise concrete scientific knowledge to an absolute. Of course, philosophy does not have the same kind of subject matter as, say, the natural sciences. Not being localized within a concrete domain of knowledge and reality, as it is in biology, geography, etc. But philosophy does have its own subject matter, and the fundamental impossibility of such localization is part of its specificity. This is the area of intellectual activity underlying which is reflection on that activity itself, and thus on its meaning, purpose and forms, ultimately, reflection on the essence of man himself as the subject of culture, that is, on his essential relations to the world. Unlike mythology, philosophy as a form of man's intellectual activity emerged together with the appearance of a new subject matter, and a new type of thought, when the focus was transferred from the idea of God to the idea of man in his relation to the world, that is, to man who studies, implements or questions the idea of divinity. In the course of history, ever new semantic nuances were introduced into the concept of the subject matter of philosophy, but deep within, philosophical knowledge has always been oriented towards clarifying the links between man and the world, towards the inherently human inner goals, causes and modes of cognizing and transforming the world. Thus philosophy is not just a specific scientific discipline. It is also a specific type of thought and even a special kind of emotional attitude, a system of worldview emotions. Immersed in this state of the spirit, man cogitates on the universe, on good and evil, the beautiful and the ugly, on social justice, truth and lie, and on the meaning and purpose of human history. Philosophical creativity answers man's deep need for a rational explanation of his place in the flow of being, of his historical destiny, personal freedom and the essence of the surrounding world. A truly scientific philosophy offers man a chance to find his place in the limitless ocean of events, to gain a deeper understanding not only of the external world, but also of his own spiritual world. In varying degree, we all need such a philosophy, for it primarily deals with humanly relevant problems. It is not only a reflective theoretical system expressing a most general vision of the world, but also a system of principles, which teaches the art of living rationally. Permeated with the moral element, philosophy, just as literature, perceives in its own way everything that ails an epoch. No concrete science can solve the problems with which philosophy is concerned. It has a mission of its own. Its study offers not only intellectual but also aesthetic and moral delight, and, most importantly, it inculcates, this is, of course, true only of progressive humanist philosophy, the civic attitude in man. Are there any internal divisions within philosophical problem areas, which are on the whole aimed at defining man's relation to the world? Such a division was outlined already in antiquity. It does not, of course, fully coincide with the present-day structure of philosophical knowledge, primarily because in the remote past philosophy comprised a great deal that was later relegated to the natural sciences. Still, even in antiquity philosophers spoke of ontology, or the study of being, fr.gk on. General case ontobs that which exists, and logos theory, of nosology or epistemology, or the theory of knowledge, fr.gk episteme knowledge, and of logic, or the theory of the forms of thought. Characteristic of classical culture was deep mutual interpenetration, not only of philosophy and theories of nature, but also of those areas of spiritual and intellectual activity, which came to be termed the human sciences in the modern times, and which now fall into several separate disciplines. Ethics as a separate science of morality, and aesthetics as a science of the harmonious structure of the world and man's corresponding attitude towards it, were just coming into being, and social philosophy in the history of philosophy had a more subordinate status than now. Besides, philosophy comprised fundamentals of linguistics, rhetoric, poetics, and musical harmony. All these areas of knowledge had yet to find a place for themselves, and to finally assert themselves in their mutual relations with philosophy, which subordinated them all to its specific tasks. Moreover, the question of the relationship between various forms of spiritual and intellectual activity and philosophy cannot be completely solved even now, and the separation of philosophical knowledge proper from the specialist knowledge embodied in the sciences is still the focus of researchers' attention on the nature of philosophical knowledge. At this point, it is not so much the subject matter of philosophy that emerges in the foreground as its relationship with other forms of social consciousness. An interesting point here is that, while in the Middle Ages it was the relationship between philosophy and religion, and thus between philosophy and the domain of the human sciences, that was the stumbling block, the subject of deliberations in the modern times has mostly been the relationship between philosophy and, first, politics, and second, science, that is, natural science. At the same time, the interest for philosophy's interaction with art and the humanities is still intensely alive. Now, what is the problem here? Why does a state of things that would appear quite obvious at first sight? Don't we all know the difference between the philosopher and the politician or physicist give rise to endless argument? The explanation lies in the fact that philosophy occupies a special place in culture, being simultaneously the focus in which the rays from all the other areas of man's cognitive and practical activity, political, emotional, aesthetic, and so on, meet, and a kind of general energy impulse for all these forms of his intellectual activity. The exact manner in which philosophy, with its own subject matter, provides at the same time generalizations of and stimuli for the various forms of creativity, has remained one of the most debatable issues. The history of culture has known practically all possible versions of the answer to the question of the place philosophy occupies, or should occupy, in the general system of human knowledge, and of the role it plays in political life and in the process of cognition. These variant approaches range from the pan-philosophical position that philosophy absorbs the wealth of all the sciences, being their concentrated synthesis and recognized leader, to total rejection of philosophy, seen as a historical relic, which has outlived its semantic usefulness, and was only necessary in the periods of, first, spontaneous, uncontrolled development of social life, and second, of insufficient level of development of concrete sciences. The adherents of pan-philosophical notions are justly reproached for scholastic dogmatism, while people intent on driving philosophy out of the domain of human knowledge are forced to ward off the reproaches, just as deserved, of being too eclectic and empirically minded. Now, why these paradoxical and polar positions? Why do some scholars insist on the abolition of philosophy, while others, on the need for its absolute supremacy? Does it all really come down to one side wanting to expand the boundaries of the philosophical sphere, to absorb all human knowledge, while the other wants to exclude the very concept of philosophy from cultural experiences? No, the thing is much more complicated than that. Underlying these arguments are the three above-mentioned mutually connected issues which cause so much conflict of opinion and ideas: the nature of philosophical knowledge in general, the subject matter of philosophy, and the relation of philosophy to politics, to the specialist sciences, and other creative manifestations. Question: is philosophy a natural outcome of the development of the needs of the human life? In other words, does it have objective causes for its existence, or is it merely a form of political ideology, or abstruse speculation on problems not yet solved by science? He who sees philosophy merely as a temporary self-consolation of a disgruntled mind would probably offer this answer. In the past, philosophy could, and did, have the status of a separate science, a special form of cognition. Thus in antiquity philosophy was in fact identical with the entire culture of the times. In the 20th century, though, In this age of unprecedented separation of the sciences, with each problem being treated in a specialist science, logic, linguistics, physics, etc., philosophy no longer has its own territory, and has thus lost its former magic power, especially in view of the fact, an opponent of philosophy would add, that it has openly stated its political or social foundations and interests, retaining merely its ideological function. But is it worth it, then, to apply the term philosophy, say, to some political doctrine? From this point of view, the word philosophy should be solemnly deposited in the archives of history, while the cause of philosophy should be carried on by the specialist sciences on the one hand, and by politics and ideology on the other. This is an extreme position, of course. Opposed to it is the other extreme, the view that philosophy, far from being put out to pasture, has assumed an absolute synthesizing function almost as great as in antiquity. What are the arguments in favor of this? An adherent of this position would say that, for the first time in history, philosophy has realized its true position as the queen of the sciences, replacing religion that has reigned for so long. For the first time it has come close enough to social life to make not only an indirect but also a direct impact on it. For the first time, too, philosophy has gained the right to evaluate and even solve conflicts not only in social and political life, but also in the economy and in academic life. If we do not openly recognize this leading role of philosophical thought, if we admit that the once splendid building of philosophical knowledge has disintegrated, its bricks pilfered by the specialist sciences, we shall thereby give up the unity of our spiritual world, which is alone capable of sustaining us in our practical activities. These two opposing stands on the interpretation of the place of philosophy are so rigid not just because they express the concern about the possibility of philosophy's hegemony, including political and ideological hegemony. The other underlying reason is the acutely polemical attitude to the relationship between philosophy and science. As for the relationship between philosophy and politics, it is fairly obvious on the one hand and extremely complex in terms of detail, on the other. Of course, philosophy cannot replace political consciousness, still less can the latter become philosophy. These are two fundamentally diverse forms of social consciousness differing in their subject matter, methods of thought, and, most importantly, their goals. At the same time, of course, there are meaningful, emotional and functional contacts between them, these mutual links being most fully manifested in the 20th century. However, these unquestioned and generally recognized close ties between philosophical and political thought must in no way give rise to the conclusion that philosophy is finished. Below, we shall dwell on the relationship between philosophical and political thought in greater detail. Those who reject the need for philosophy in our times deny its political claims on the grounds that it is not a science. For those who see it as a form of social consciousness called upon to generalize and control all the other forms, it is, above all, a science. In the first case, the role of philosophy is belittled through putting it outside science. In the second, it is elevated as being more scientific than all the sciences, and even capable of affecting the social evolution. In both instances, the view is manifested, in one way or another, that the only true form of knowledge is rational knowledge, and that only in the interpretation it is given in the natural sciences. This methodological orientation, which belittles the importance of all knowledge that does not have a strictly rational form, has come to be known as scientism. The positions of scientism are so influential that the question of the relationship between philosophy and science must be considered in greater detail. The problem of the scientific nature of philosophy and the limitations of scientism. A little history first. Before the 19th century, science occupied a special, and quite respectable, place in European culture. Still, it came third or even fourth after religion, philosophy and art. the crisis of the religious world perception which gave way to philosophy, on the one hand, and the triumph of rational thought over the intuitive methods of art, on the other, led in the past century to science moving up to occupy the second rung, the one below philosophy, in this conventional hierarchy of values. In the 20th century, despite the fairly serious decline of rationalism in the first 2 or 3 decades, the prestige of scientific knowledge later rose so high that science actually found itself in the vanguard. The dilemma itself of the end or efflorescence of philosophy, referred to above, was provoked precisely by the type of thought characteristic of scientism, which expressed this dilemma in the following way: if philosophy is not a science, it must cede its positions. If it does not cede them, that will mean that it is a science. This position cannot, of course, be justified. The question of whether philosophy is a science or not cannot be given an unambiguous solution since, on the one hand, if it is a science, it is not a science in the same sense as the natural disciplines. If, on the other hand, it is not a science, this does not mean that it loses all the attributes of scientific knowledge. Let us deal with this point more thoroughly. What precisely is so anti-scientific about philosophical knowledge, from the standpoint of scientism? In the first place, an adherent of scientism will reproach philosophy for the undemonstrability and fundamental unverifiability of its truths, for the fact that philosophy does not contain scientific knowledge, for being, on the contrary, so imprecise that it is closer to art than to science. This reproach is far from new. Already in antiquity, the skeptics censured philosophy for its inability to provide irrefutable truths. Let us not forget, though, that they leveled the same critique against science itself. The epoch of enlightenment, also cited by scientism today, was just as critical. Let Rousseau speak. I will ask only these questions. What is philosophy? What is contained in the writings of the most famous philosophers? What are the lessons taught by those friends of wisdom? Listening to them, we have the impression that they are mountebanks in a public square, each one shouting, "Come to me, only I will tell you the truth." One of them teaches that there is no such thing as matter, but that everything exists only in representation. Another declares that there is no other substance than matter, and no other God than the world itself. A third tells you that there are no such things as virtue and vice, and that moral good and evil are chimeras, while a fourth informs you that men are only beasts of prey, and may conscientiously devour one another. But the adherents of scientism neglect the fact that the French philosophers of the 18th century did not at all propose to divorce philosophy from science. On the contrary, they called for a harmony, the essential merging of the two in the face of the then prevailing religious world perception. This eternal doubting of the usefulness and reliability of knowledge has reached, in the view of scientism, its highest point today. Can the philosophical mode of thought be treated seriously these days? They ask, if each philosophical argument can be convincingly refuted by a counter-argument, and if philosophers are unable to apply in their field the strictly scientific proofs and verifiable methods evolved by mathematics and natural science. Moreover, philosophy is incapable not only of experimentally proving its principles, it is still less capable of productive forecast. Human reason is alleged to be capable only of predictions based on knowledge obtained through experience, observation and experiment, as, for example, in physics, biology, and the other sciences. But the ground slips from under its feet as soon as it leaves the sphere of experience for the rough seas of the deep universal problems, or, even more precariously, hypotheses of the future. Since there is no criterion of the reliability of philosophical knowledge, representatives of scientism reason, philosophy cannot be regarded as a science with predictive force. The argument of scientism about the lack of predictive force in philosophical knowledge is often linked with Hegel's well-known and bitterly ironic aphorism, about the owl of Minerva, to the effect that philosophy lays claim to instructing the world, but always comes too late to do that. The very appearance of philosophy, with the given content, on the historical arena means that the sun has gone down. When philosophy paints its grey and grey, then has a shape of life grown old. By philosophy's grey and grey it cannot be rejuvenated but only understood. The owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of the dusk. 1. An adherent of scientism who rejects the scientific nature of philosophy attempts to belittle its significance, even unto complete dissolution of it in common sense or practical wisdom. On the contrary, a follower of scientism who has hopes of philosophy's revival sees it as a superstitions which, generalizing the results of the specialist sciences at the philosophical level, directly controls their further development. He also draws the conclusion that, along with the general movement of culture to increasing rationalization, philosophy becomes a science in the direct and even natural scientific sense of the word. Let us note, however, that the tendency towards rationalization of philosophical knowledge, after the model of the natural sciences, can result not only in such historically positive developments, as the emergence of really necessary new disciplines, for example, social psychology, but also in such an objectively negative consequence, as the disappearance of philosophy, as a special form of knowledge. Can we accept then, the reader may ask, the proposition of scientism that philosophy, not being a science, has no right to exist? Or should we consider yet another option, not yet broached here, that philosophy has a right to live, but its methods, goals and means must not be similar to those of natural science, which means that they must remain irrational, unlike the former two? This last viewpoint is based on antiscientism rather than scientism, on the opposition of philosophy as the highest truth, arrived at only by irrational and intuitive methods, to science as the lower or utilitarian truth which only satisfies man's base, material needs. At its extreme, this position rejects in principle the application of any scientific methods to the solution of philosophical problems proper. For philosophy can only fulfill its historical mission if it gives up any attempts at scientific reasoning. However strange this position might seem in the age of the scientific and technical revolution, which has revealed to mankind both the mysteries of the microcosm and the laws of cosmic processes, it has numerous supporters. Present-day irrationalism is a reaction against the extremes of scientism described above. It is a vote of no confidence in the rational doctrines of science and politics. Doesn't it follow that philosophy need not aspire towards a scientific status? Considering that the orientation towards supremacy of scientific rational cognition, engendered by our times, is more and more called in question. But the problem of the relationship between philosophy and science cannot be solved simplistically, as proposed by the three approaches described above. The whole point is that the relationship between philosophy and science is very complex, and the two must neither be equated with each other nor separated by a wall. Wherein lies the complexity of the relationship between philosophy and science? Along what parameters are their correspondences and differences established? Science is built on experiment, and on the formulation of knowledge that remains true regardless of the changing conditions of human existence. A scientific truth is, as it were, indifferent towards man, it is objective. However, philosophy, too, seeks above all the objective aspect, its own specific form of harmony with the reality. As it is only in form that philosophy is distinguished from other modes of cognition, Hegel writes, it must necessarily be in harmony with actuality and experience. One philosophy cannot be constructed on the natural scientific model, having its own criteria of exactness and demonstrability. Philosophy is just as objective as science, in the sense that its subject matter is the objective nature of man's relation to the world, rather than his subjective sensibility. The development of philosophy is not linear and consistent like the logical course of scientific thought. Like any theoretical system verified on purely rational principles, philosophical thought moves along a great many lines, as if piercing its object on various sides. Even the form of prediction characteristic of philosophical thought differs significantly from scientific hypotheses. Philosophy provides the general cognitive impulse which largely stimulates the emergence of concrete natural scientific hypotheses. The same is true of philosophy's social predictions, determined, basically, by the general direction of mankind's social evolution. Philosophical prediction cannot at the same time aspire towards substantiation of the concrete details of the future. That is the sphere of the specialist sciences, where philosophy attempts predictions concerning the concrete details of the evolution. It may confidently be said to undergo rationalization after the model of the exact sciences. Properly speaking, philosophy either disappears there as such or becomes an obstacle in the way of free development of scientific knowledge. There is also the separate issue of what is known as the synthesizing mission of philosophy, that of generalizing the results of the specialist disciplines. What does philosophical generalization mean? Should it aspire towards a summing up of the history of knowledge, philosophy would face an insoluble task, for the human mind has historical and individual limitations. Such a summing up was to some extent possible in the times of Aristotle. But in these days no single man, however talented, erudite, and endowed with a phenomenal memory, can be at home in all of the fields of scientific knowledge. And anyway, philosophical thought should not attempt this task, for it will never be able to replace the specialists in any one given field. Generalization is, in its form, an essentially rational act performed within the framework of the given specialist discipline, whose results are subjected to this generalization. Integration of knowledge is quite a different thing. Here indeed philosophy is quite capable of finding, even before the contiguous disciplines take shape, the points of contact and the unified basic principles of disjoint sciences. But integration of the data of the specialist disciplines cannot be regarded as philosophy's principal task. It is merely a subsidiary function. Philosophy has a subject matter of its own and, consequently, its own goals and special means of achieving these goals. Philosophy is not a protective or controlling organ in the state of the sciences, but an independent field of spiritual knowledge taking part in the direct production of ideas, rather than in their forced distribution and regulation. It is only when the conclusions of the specialist sciences begin to be used for various ideological purposes that philosophy, staying within its domain, does some generalizing work. The scientist's philosophical frame of mind may or may not help him in his professional activity, and philosophy certainly plays a significant role here. Philosophy can and must react, in terms of worldview, to the discoveries of the specialist disciplines that previously seemed fantastic, such as the Big Bang idea or, say, the methods of genetic engineering. In doing so, philosophy acts as the interpreter of the achievements of all the areas of knowledge. But philosophy cannot and must not interfere in the process of scientific creativity itself. It must not decide arbitrarily which of the new standpoints, including the theoretically questionable ones, have the right to exist and which have not. Two questions have yet to be answered to clarify the relationship between philosophy and science. First, the interaction between the logically rational and the intuitive, and second, the effect of the philosopher's or the scientist's personality on the results of his activity. It would be wrong to assume that science is nothing but the logically rational, while philosophy and art are nothing but the intuitive. But the diametrically opposed interpretation of philosophy as purely rational knowledge, sometimes stated in scientistically oriented arguments, is also erroneous. The power and significance of a given philosophy lies not so much in the purely logical demonstrability, as in the depth of its insights, in the ability to pose new problems, to attain a better understanding of important aspects of human being and activity, and, finally, to be the source and stimulus for further movement of thought, to be a methodological instrument of scientific cognition and practical transforming activity. The possibilities of intuitive insights and of predictive impulses to scientific cognition do not mean that philosophy can be a kind of mystic oracle revealing truths which came no one knows how or whence, and which are not amenable to rational interpretation. We may pay tribute to the intuitive and the irrational, but that does not at all mean that rationalism in general, and the need for the demonstrability of the philosophical form of the expression of truth in particular, can be ignored. On the other hand, the orientation towards the logically rational, characteristic of the sciences, does not negate the significant role of intuitive insights in natural scientific activity either. Intuition and logic-governed reason are inseparable in any form of human creativity. Their union is a necessary element in the birth of the truth. In this respect, the difference between philosophy and science consists in the fact that science aspires towards a logical orderliness of its propositions, which are confirmed at every step experimentally and theoretically, which ultimately leads to the independence of the natural scientific conclusions from the scientists who discover and formulate them, from the subjective factor in general, while philosophy aspires on the contrary towards a profoundly convincing presentation of its knowledge, in worldview terms, although the importance of the rational elements is, of course, fully realized. This difference is ultimately due to the difference in the very subject matter of science and philosophy. Indeed, the basic properly philosophical problems, that is the principles on which the relationship between man and the world are founded, are not amenable to natural scientific methods. Philosophy as a science requires rigorous and well thought out methods, theoretically convincing formulations, and an orderly systematic presentation of its concepts, categories, principles and laws. It is akin to science at the level of general theory, provided it is considered as an integral entity. But philosophy is not just a science. Although it is based on the thinker's immediate experiences, it has no empirical research devices at its disposal. The truth and effectiveness of philosophical theory are verified as a rule by the entire stream of life events, rather than by separate experiments and observations. The specificity of the creative cognitive process also has a bearing on the role of the personality, creating a philosophical or scientific work. Of course, the individual plays an essential role both in science and in philosophy, whose very existence would be impossible without him. In stating this, we do not refer to man as a condition of the situation of cognition, or to man as such, but precisely to personality, that is, an individual with a definite creative potential. If Einstein had not lived, the theory of relativity would have been discovered by a person of equal creative potential. In the same way, had not Marx lived, dialectical materialism would have emerged in the history of philosophy all the same, through the work of a personality of the same genius. Still, there is a difference here between the specialist disciplines and philosophy. In a sense, philosophy is closer to art than to science. Without Byron, Romanticism would have replaced, in one way or another, classicism and sentimentalism, in accordance with the objective logic of the development of art. But in any case, the history of culture would not have known such a literary hero as Childe Harold without Byron and Prince Myshkin without Dostoevsky. In art, personality is in principle irreplaceable. All attempts to introduce a unitary model into philosophy, to emasculate it by removing the personality element, only led to dogmatism and thoughtless repetition of certain truths. As a result, real philosophical texts give way to a stream of uniform pseudo-philosophical writings. Just as art, philosophy only develops where the personal element is welcome. Without the personality energy and creative elan, Mass-produced philosophy becomes an averaged-out ideology. Man and his relation to the world is the principal subject matter of philosophy. Man as personality is the only possible subject of it. Philosophy asserts man as the highest value of the world, as the starting point of philosophical knowledge, and this knowledge must therefore inevitably assume a personality-oriented form, the language and style of philosophical thought. Philosophy is a special form of social consciousness, and is thus based on an original style of thought. The following questions may be asked in this connection. Does philosophy have a language of its own? Does a philosophical text differ, say, from a sociological, economic, or political one? There have been trends within philosophy itself, which were particularly concerned with analysis of the language of philosophical texts. Thus the main proposition of the Vienna Circle, led by Ludwig von Wittgenstein, was this: philosophy will always contain the possibility of ambiguity and dogmatism, unless it radically changes the mode of presentation accepted in it. From this standpoint, philosophy has only itself to blame for undemonstrability and vacuity, having fallen into the numerous traps of natural language. To avoid this kind of situation, Wittgenstein insisted on therapy for the philosophical language in order to overcome in philosophy the polysemy and fundamental imprecision of natural everyday usage. But Wittgenstein and his followers sought this therapy in extreme formalization of philosophical language, in bringing it closer to the language of mathematics and natural science. Philosophy, however, has inherited in many respects the lexicon and syntactical means not only of science but also of art. As specialist studies have shown, it has a language of its own based on the philosophical style of thought, a language that reflects both the specificity of its subject matter and the special intellectual tenor that is linked precisely with philosophizing. Just as the other kinds and genres of speech, philosophy has worked out a form of language usage with a distinctive modal coloring, rhetorical devices, an unusual form of combining the logical and the emotional elements. A truly philosophical text cannot be confused with texts from science, journalism or fiction. There are, of course, a great many gradations between these basic forms of language usage, but the specificity of each of them is so obvious, and is on the whole so directly perceived by the reader, that the fundamental relevance of a text to science, art or philosophy can always be recognized even in synthetic styles. Leaving aside the concrete conclusions and recommendations of researchers in philosophical language, that is a special subject of interest to professionals only, let us note merely that the close attention to the language of philosophy came into the foreground in connection with certain negative processes in this area. Thus, there is clear evidence of such a morbid symptom as empty wordplay, divorced from concrete semantic content. Philosophical thought often abuses the word. This is first of all true of the idealist systems, in which scholastic verbalization sometimes assumes highly involved forms divorced from the needs of thought. Francis Bacon, the English philosopher, criticized in his theory of the idols this sort of verbalization, which is a caricature of the scholastic devices, a mere waffle. It would be wrong, though, to reproach idealism alone for such waffling. Unfortunately, non-idealist literature, too, offers examples of pseudo-scientific philosophizing in deliberately complicated verbal form, when the thought content is trivial but the text is an impenetrable verbal thicket, which creates an illusion of profundity despite the actual triviality. The language is also negatively affected by the dogmaticization of the content of philosophical texts, which is expressed in their anonymity and personality, in worn language clichés and empty rhetoric instead of proof. An impersonal averaged-out style is unacceptable in philosophical language. All outstanding philosophers would distinguish both for the individual content of their ideas, and for their individual language style. Marx, Engels and Lenin, as well as Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Schelling, Hegel and Schopenhauer had profoundly individual styles. Lenin's impassioned philosophical language, and the disciplined power of the language of Marx, are instantly recognizable. An impersonal language indifferent to the subject matter in hand, as if churned out by a single standardized mechanism, is detrimental to philosophy. It must have a distinct individual coloring, and differ clearly from the language of natural scientists, sociologists, economists, or politicians. Philosophy in its human dimension. At this point, we can already offer a more extended description of the domain of philosophical knowledge than at the beginning of the present section. Indeed, what is meant concretely by the statement that the focus of philosophy is man and his relationship with the natural and social world? First, it should be emphasized that philosophy does not regard man as an object. Man as object is dealt with in the human or social sciences, such as psychology, but as a subject. Second, the subject matter of philosophy is not the individual subject with his particular qualities, but subject as the general, as a universal category opposed to the category, just as universal, of object. It does not only study, say, the problem of self but the problem of relationship between this self and others, the problem of understanding as a central issue in the theory of knowledge. Third, philosophy purports to free man's thought from the various traps, rational, formal, intuitive, etc., embedded within this thought. These include, in particular, a vision of reality obscured by the verbal means of its expression. This requires the ability for correcting the cognitive operations and instruments to suit the reality. In other words, philosophy frees the human mind from the obstacles to an adequate perception of the world inherent in the mind itself, being better prepared than the specialist disciplines for the overcoming of the most widespread prejudices of reason, such as neglect for the differences in the modes of concept usage, in the meanings of words, etc. It acts as the methodological purgatory for experimental and, more generally, for all specialists' knowledge-seeking true road. Fourth, philosophy meditates not just on man as subject but on man in his relation to the world. It strives to find the common features in the world of objects, and in the world of the subject. That is, the universal laws of being, but most importantly, it attempts to identify the form of the subject's relation to the entire diversity of objective phenomena, to determine man's concrete and unique place in the universe of being. Therein lies its worldview function, for no creative activity of man is possible outside a general worldview orientation. Fifth, philosophy answers the central question arising out of the consideration of man's relation to the world, the so-called basic question of philosophy, the question of the primacy of objective or subjective being. This problem covers the forms of reflection of the world of objects by the subject, and the modes of establishing the correctness or truth of the subjective image of the objective world. Sixth and last, philosophy substantiates its subject matter as the universal pivot of the process of cognition in general. That is why the human dimension of philosophy causes such great interest. The view is sometimes taken as a basic philosophical axiom that the universe is in itself the way we perceive it. However, there is a great deal in the universe that is inaccessible to our perception. Man directly observes only processes of a strictly determined type, while processes of a different type unfold without witnesses. It would therefore be more precise to say that the universe opens itself up to us to the extent to which we as observers ask it quite definite questions determined by our human essence. By its very nature, the universe assumed the emergence of life and consequently of man. That is why there is a direct link between the existence of man and the fundamental properties of the universe. The identification of that link is a significant task of science and philosophy too. Philosophy is the theoretical basis of worldview, its essence and vital meaning. A worldview is a system of generalized sensibilities, of intuitive notions and theoretical views of the surrounding world and man's place in it, of man's many-sided relations to the world, to himself and to other people, a system of the basic orientations in life, not always consciously realized, of an individual, a definite social group or society, their convictions, ideals and value orientations, their socio-political, moral, aesthetic and religious principles of knowledge and judgments. A worldview is a kind of spiritual framework of the structure of an individual, class, or society as a whole. The existence of a worldview is an indication of the maturity, not only of an individual, but also of social groups, of political parties. The subject of a worldview can thus be a personality, a social group, and society as a whole. An individual develops into a personality only when he forms a definite worldview. Outside a worldview, an individual is not a personality in the proper sense of the word. A worldview is a spiritual and intellectual structure with many levels, one that combines everyday notions comprising rational and irrational elements, reason and prejudices, scientific, artistic and political views. Historically, the first elements of worldview content were the notions of everyday consciousness, mythological and religious views, which played a definite role in the consolidation of the forms of social organization of the life of human collectives. With the development of practical cognitive activity, with the separation of science as a special sphere, the worldview becomes more and more scientific in nature, the share of scientific notions in it steadily growing. Thus the worldview content changed in keeping with the changes of the forms of the practical assimilation and theoretical interpretation of the world. Knowledge, or the information aspect of a worldview, is thus its basis. All cognition molds the worldview framework, but philosophical science plays the most important part in this process. For philosophy emerged and took shape as a response to the worldview concerns of mankind. That was why worldviews were always linked in the first place with philosophical views. Although the former were historically independent and much broader in content than the concept of philosophy, any philosophy clearly has a worldview function, but not all worldviews are philosophic. Philosophy is the theoretical nucleus of a worldview. Knowledge by no means exhausts the content of a worldview. For knowledge to acquire worldview meaning, it must be considered in the light of our evaluation and our attitude towards it. We evaluate all things in terms of the interests of a definite social group, of society, and of an individual. There is nothing to which we would be completely indifferent, especially as far as our higher vital values are concerned. That is why worldviews have been, since time immemorial, an area of spiritual conflict of different social forces, social classes and even separate individuals. That means that part of the structure of worldview is also evaluation of knowledge. In other words, along with information content, worldviews have axiological content. Knowledge is only poured into the worldview vessel when it becomes conviction. Convictions are a constant component of a worldview, the prism through which reality is seen. They express not only an intellectual position but also an emotional state, a stable psychological orientation, an unshakable confidence in the rightness of our ideals, principles and views. Convictions are ideas implemented in actions, and actions illumined by an idea. It is convictions that form the most important element in the worldview of a strong and socially active personality. Ideals, along with knowledge, value orientations and convictions, form part of the worldview structure. Human life is inconceivable without ideals. Like the beckoning lights of hope, they warm human hearts and nourish dreams. Ideals are the horizon towards which all the thoughts, feelings and actions of men are directed. Ideals can be scientifically founded or illusory. They can be real and attainable or unattainable. As a rule, they are directed towards the future, rooted in the system of the spiritual needs and interests of society and individual. They are determined by practice, by the entire experiences of mankind, in their turn. They make an effective impact on the life activity of both society and individual ideals, especially those that have been tested by experience, constitute the basis or tenor of the whole of the spiritual and intellectual life. The more elevated the personal and social ideals, the greater the stature of the personality and the more progressive the given society. The richer and nobler the content of individual and social life. A worldview whose structure incorporates ideals cannot be defined as a mere reflection of reality. The presence of ideals in it marks it as anticipatory reflection, as an ideal force which does not merely reflect reality but also calls for its alteration. By themselves, though, ideals do not form an integral and effective worldview, unless they are combined with the socio-political practical activities of the masses. A worldview is formed by social conditions, education and training. It takes shape in childhood. From the very beginning of the child's socialization, his involvement in the life of society, and the process continues in fact throughout man's life. It determines the individual's position in life, being realized in the character of labor and social activity, in family and society. In the final analysis, the measure of man's worldview maturity is his deeds, his actions. Relying on the Marxist principle of historism in the study of worldview as an integral phenomenon, one can speak of historical types of worldview embodying in concentrated form the norms and principles of consciousness, and the styles of thought determined by a given historical epoch, or a given class. Human society being socially heterogeneous, different social groups and classes may be said to have different social types of worldview, depending on whether the interests of a given class coincide with the objective tendency of social development, whether it is the carrier of a more progressive mode of production. Its worldview may, in content and social significance, be consistently scientific or unscientific, materialist or idealist, revolutionary or reactionary. Thus the worldview of the bourgeoisie was progressive when it was a rising class opposed to feudalism, but after it asserted its power, its worldview became conservative and reactionary. The basic question of philosophy, materialism and idealism. Whatever problem the philosopher might study, and whatever thread of philosophical thought he might be trying to unravel, he will come up, sooner or later, against an issue which he will be unable to bypass. That issue is the basic question of philosophy, the question of the relation of thinking to being. Running against this problem, the philosopher will have to choose, willy-nilly, a position which will determine the whole of his philosophy. It will determine whether it will be materialist or idealist. The crux of the basic question of philosophy is the recognition of two main types of reality: objective or material and subjective or ideal, one of which precedes the other and engenders it. Does matter precede consciousness, or is it the other way round? Does matter produce, at a definite level in its development, its finest flower, reason, or does the world spirit, on the contrary, create the material world, or do they perhaps coexist as two equal substances? These problems are the core of the basic question of philosophy, but they are only one of its aspects. Materialism rejects all the unscientific interpretations of the origin and essence of the world. For its starting point, it takes the world which exists objectively and independently of the consciousness of man and of mankind. Explanation of the world from the world itself, such is the worldview and methodological principle of materialism. Idealism holds the opposite view, insisting that the development of the world is determined by the spiritual element. Some philosophers in the past recognized the equality of both elements, the material and the ideal. They were known as dualists. The other aspect of the basic question of philosophy calls for just as fundamental a solution: is the world knowable? Can man grasp its objective laws? Those who believe that the world is in principle unknowable are called agnostics. The most striking example of agnosticism is religious philosophy, which rejects the knowability of the world in its desire to assert the primacy of faith over reason. Why is the question of the relation of thinking to being so fundamental, despite its fairly abstract character? The reason is that the solution of this problem determines the approach to all the other problems of philosophy proper. The problem of the method of philosophy, of practice and truth, the motive forces of history, etc., and, moreover, to all the general theoretical, worldview issues of any other sciences attempting to grasp the essence of the universe and life, that is, of sciences that make a significant contribution to the construction of the scientific picture of the world, as applied to social history. The basic question of philosophy is formulated as the problem of the relation of social being to social consciousness. One or the other view of this problem determines the interpretation of the decisive forces of social development. The question is whether ideas and reason govern history, or whether the basis of social development is material production, and the socio-economic and other social relations that follow from it. The basic question of philosophy is thus not just the problem of the relation of thinking to being in general but, more concretely, of the relation of social consciousness to social being. The materialist approach to this issue is straightforward. Social being ultimately determines social consciousness, and social consciousness, derivatively, makes in its turn a great impact on this being. Idealism holds a directly opposite position on this issue, and different idealist philosophies are distinguished only by their interpretation of the nature of the motive force. It may be God, or the objective world spirit, or the ideas of historical personalities. In its development, philosophical materialism passed through several significant stages, from the naive form in antiquity through mechanical and metaphysical forms to its highest stage, dialectical materialism. These stages will be considered in detail below. Here we shall merely point out that, inasmuch as men cannot ignore the objective existence of the material world in their everyday life, they act in this sphere as materialists, some spontaneously, others consciously, with full theoretical and philosophical awareness. Idealism also has various forms. Thus objective idealists, ancient and modern ones alike, Plato, Hegel, and others, recognize the existence of a real world outside man, but they believe that underlying it is reason. The irrationalist variety of objective idealism, Schopenhauer and others, postulates an unconscious unreasonable element alien vital, blind will, etc., as the basis of being. From the point of view of subjective idealism, the objective world independent of man does not exist. It is the product of man's subjective cognitive abilities, sensations, and perceptions. Hence the fundamental idea of this philosophical system, as represented by Berkeley or Mark. Things are complexes of sensations, and to exist means to be perceived by man's sense organs. Subjective idealists insist that our attempts to go beyond consciousness are in vain, and the existence of an outside world independent of our mind is therefore impossible to prove. Indeed, we know the world as it is given to man, and to the extent in which it is reflected in our consciousness through the senses. But that does not at all mean that the perception of the world is the world itself. Even our everyday experiences show that the objects of perception continue to exist when we do not perceive them, say, before or after perception. In other words, even everyday experiences demonstrate that the being of things does not depend on the act of their perception. A logical development of the ideas of subjective idealism leads to solipsism, to the assertion that nothing but the self exists. Subjective idealist is thus not unlike a person who finds himself in a room with magic mirrors for walls. He sees nothing but himself on all sides and can never find a way out, colliding everywhere with his own reflection. Materialism relies on the achievements of science and practice, whereas idealism often goes side by side with religion, being its indirect and sometimes direct foundation. Despite the links between idealism and religion, they must not be identified. Religion relies on faith and emotions, while idealism appeals to reason. endeavoring to prove its propositions theoretically. The history of philosophical thought is more complex than the schema outlined here. As a rule, pre-Marxian materialists were idealists in the explanation of the phenomena of social life. Their explanations of natural phenomena, too, although on the whole materialist, were not entirely consistent, as they sometimes postulated a certain prime mover, or recognized the initial act of divine creation, which was then eliminated from their explanation of natural phenomena. What is the source of these difficulties in the development of philosophical thought? Idealism is not a whim of philosophers straying just because they are dim-witted. On the contrary, many of them were geniuses. Idealism has its epistemological and social roots. Cognition of the world is a very complex and extremely contradictory process. It is far from rectilinear, moving mostly in zigzags and roundabout ways. Along a spiral we find here free play of the imagination, common sense, cunning, the power of consistent logic, and assumptions that may be very similar or far from reality. This flow of questing, creative thought veering from side to side and sometimes rushing up blind alleys is inevitably fraught with the possibility of errors and delusions, as demonstrated by the experiences of man's intellectual life. Philosophical idealism is a one-sided, exaggerated, development, inflation, distension, of one of the features, aspects, facets of knowledge into an absolute, divorced from matter, from nature, apatheosized one. Thus the process itself of cognitive activity contains the potential for divorcing thought from reality, and for departure for the realm of the imagination, which inevitably forces the researcher to choose the false path. It is a well-known fact that things and their properties are given to us in the form of sensations, and that the subjective images of these things are realized by us as existing where their object is located. For instance, looking at a green leaf, we perceive this greenness as belonging to the leaf itself. Contemplating the blue sky, we ascribe objective being to the blueness. Subjective idealism exaggerates out of all proportion this aspect of our cognition. Relying on empirically given experience, it gives it an erroneous theoretical interpretation, namely, it interprets the subjective form in which the object is given to the subject as the object itself. That is, it reduces things to sensations and sensations to things. But any biophysicist will explain that greenness or blueness are sensations reflecting the visible spectrum of electromagnetic oscillations of definite frequencies and wavelengths, and that in themselves the waves are neither green nor blue. The subjective form in which the object is given us must therefore be distinguished from the objective source existing by itself, and this is exactly what a scientific materialist does. 1 If subjective idealism unlocks itself within the sphere of the cognizing individual, and the sensuous form of his cognition, objective idealism, on the contrary, lifts the result of human thought, of man's entire culture, to an absolute, ascribing to it absolutely independent suprapersonal being and active power. This logic of human thought is expanded to cover the whole world, becoming the logic of being itself. The epistemological roots of objective idealism go down deep into history, being linked with the formation of abstract concepts, with the progress of cognitive activity and reason's penetration into the essence of things. The problem arose of relating the general and the individual, the essence and its manifestations. It was not a simple matter for man to understand the way in which the general reflected in, say, the concept of beauty was related to the individual form of its being in a given object. For example, a wise man dies, but wisdom, becoming imperishable, is preserved as something general, and exists in the system of culture as something suprapersonal being divorced from the individual. The general came to be perceived as something existing absolutely. Thus objective idealism begins where the idea of a thing is thought of not as a reflection of this thing, but as eternally pre-existing it, determining its structure, properties and relations, and continuing to exist after the destruction of this thing. For instance, Already in antiquity, Pythagoras thought of numbers as independent essences ruling the world, while in Plato general concepts or ideas made up a realm of pure thought and beauty that had engendered the world of visible reality. Objective idealism raised to an absolute not only the results of human activity, but also men's creative activity itself, divorcing the one from the other. That was the reason why in pre-Marxian history of philosophy man's active, creative capacity was mostly studied by objective idealism. The idea of a thing created by man pre-exists the thing itself, in terms of time and of the very essence of that thing, which is derivative from the purpose and design. Most of the things surrounding us are results of our creative activity, so that the idea of creation becomes a kind of spectacles through which we look at the world. It is not all that simple for man to give up that idea and to think of the world as eternally existing, not created by anyone. The eternal existence of the world without a creator was therefore beyond the comprehension of some people, still is, as a matter of fact. Hence the assumption of the existence of a universal creator and ruler. 3. Philosophy as general methodology. Method and methodology. Theory and method. Methods originate in practical activity as generalized devices that conform with the properties and laws of reality, with the objective logic of the things at the transformation of which human activity is directed. The methods of practical activity thus reflect the historically formed and socially consolidated modes of man's sensuously objective interaction with the world. This was the basis for the formation of cognitive and later theoretical devices used in the assimilation and transformation of reality, and for the molding, in the process of the development of science, of theoretical methods, sets of devices and operations directing the mind towards the path leading to the truth. The choice of methods is conditioned both by the nature of the phenomenon under study, and by the tasks pursued by the researcher. All other things equal, it is precisely the method that largely determines the depth of penetration into the essence of the object of study. Each science works out methods of its own. At present, the system of scientific methods is so complex that the need arises for their classification. Some of the extremely diverse methods of science are used in one discipline only, and are characteristic of its specific domain. These methods are referred to as particular, or concrete, scientific ones. Accordingly, the general scientific methods are those that are used by a number or group of sciences. Philosophy is a universal method, its subject matter being the most universal principles of thought, of all cognition. It is sometimes naively believed that, owing to the universality of its method, philosophy can yield true knowledge in a concrete scientific field. Nothing could be more absurd and harmful than this delusion. It is inconceivable that we should succeed in, say, making a table by relying on general principles only. This example, deliberately grotesque, shows the whole absurdity of the idea. This view of the methodological function of philosophy turns it into a set of frozen and immutable formulas, depriving it of the most important, essential and necessary element, the ability to develop and be enriched by real historical and scientific practice. Philosophical methods do not determine unambiguously the course of the creative search for the truth. In the final analysis, the decisive factor here is practical life. Every method enables us to cognize only some individual aspects of the object, hence the need for mutual complementarity of methods, each of which is limited in the scope of its cognitive potential. The universal methods of philosophy are a necessary condition for the solution of various concrete tasks. They do not replace the special, concrete scientific methods. Rather, they are given concrete form in these methods. The special methods are particular devices for the discovery of the laws governing the objects under study, while the philosophical methods are devices for the study of the same objects, with the aim of discovering in them the universal laws of movement and development, manifested in specific ways in accordance with the specificity of the object. The need for the selection and substantiation of methods, and for clarifying their relationships naturally gave rise to methodology, as a particular area of philosophical and scientific theoretical knowledge, as a system of the basic principles or elements of generalized modes of the organization and construction of theoretical and practical activity, and as the theory of such a system. In short, philosophical theory emerges both as meaningful theoretical knowledge and as a general methodology. What is, then, the relationship between theory and method in it? In general form, the relationship is this. Theory is the result of the process of cognition, while method is the mode of obtaining and constructing knowledge. However, in concrete scientific knowledge, the mode of obtaining that knowledge does not as a rule form part of the result of the knowledge itself, for the latter reflects a concrete fragment of reality, while the method forms a superstructure over knowledge, over the meaningful part of the theory. In philosophy, on the other hand, each theoretical proposition and concept becomes at the same time a methodological principle. Philosophical theory is at the same time method. In view of this, philosophy may be said to perform a general methodological function in relation to the entire scientific cognition. Dialectics as theory and as method. In Marxism, dialectics emerges as the theory of the most general law-governed links, and the evolution and development of being and knowledge, and the method of creative cognition and thought based on this theory. One dialectics is the one. The word dialectics was first used by Socrates to denote the art of conducting debate or dialogue, FRGK dialogo mei converse, confrontation of ideas, rejection of false paths, gradual attainment of correct knowledge. All this is dialectics. We find it where there is conflict of opposites and struggle of ideas. Transferred later on to the objective world, it came to mean the presence in it of contradictions, their identification and resolution, struggle, development, progress. Theory of development in its most complete, deep-going, and comprehensive form, it is the theory of the relativity of human knowledge reflecting eternally developing reality. Dialectics is formed by the unity of its two aspects, subjective and objective, as the theory of the development of thought, cognition, of the struggle of ideas in science, art, philosophy, in spiritual and intellectual life in general. Dialectics is subjective. It unfolds in the subject's mind as a reflection of the connections of objective being independent of man and of mankind, that is, of objective dialectics. Such is the materialist principle of the interpretation of the relationship between objective and subjective dialectics, considered in their unity. Our view that the world is dialectical imperatively requires a dialectical approach to it. The measure of dialectical content in human thought is determined by the level of social practice and, accordingly, by the degree of the cognition of the dialectics of being, reflection of which is a necessary condition of rational orientation in the world, and its transformation in the interests of men. Dialectics affords a reflection of the extremely complex and contradictory processes of the material and spiritual world. It is living, many-sided knowledge, with the number of sides eternally increasing, with an infinite number of shades of every approach and approximation to reality, one reflecting objective reality. All principles and laws of dialectics point, at the same time, to the correct manner of reasoning about the corresponding area of this reality. That is why dialectics is the theory not of external forms of thought, but of the laws of development of all material, natural and spiritual things, that is, of the development of the entire concrete content of the world and of its cognition. That is, the sum total, the conclusion of the history of knowledge of the world. Dialectics is not a mere statement of that which happens in reality, but an instrument of scientific cognition and transformation, an instrument for moving from the domain of non-knowledge into the realm of knowledge, a methodology of knowledge based on action and a methodology of action based on knowledge. It is in this that the unity of dialectics as theory and as method is manifested. The statement that dialectics is both theory and method does not mean that it is identical with Marxist philosophy as a whole. In the same way materialism, being a theory and a method, can one theory not be equated with philosophy as a whole? The point is that both dialectics and materialism, considered in this capacity, are the universal fundamental principles of Marxist philosophy which enable it to perform its worldview, theoretical, and methodological functions. Dialectics and metaphysics. Dialectics emerged and developed in the struggle against the metaphysical method of thinking, or metaphysics. A characteristic feature of metaphysics has always been one-sidedness, abstractness, and the lifting of certain elements to an absolute, placing a certain object outside the context of its natural links with other objects. A metaphysically thinking person ignores this integral context of the object's being, and it is only this context that can help to clarify the object's essence, by demonstrating its links and role in the whole, and in the movement of that whole. Metaphysics is characterized by the static mode of thinking, by the veering of thought from one extreme to the other, by exaggeration of some aspect of an object, such as stability, repetition, and relative independence. Generally speaking, metaphysical elements in thought are not something unnatural or alien to the very essence of human knowledge. The fact is that man cannot attain knowledge without separating and dismembering the whole into constituent parts. These operations underlie the analytical capacity of thought. Neither can cognition do without involuntary, and at times quite voluntary, simplification. We cannot imagine, express, measure, depict movement, without interrupting continuity, without simplifying, coarsening, dismembering, strangling that which is living. The representation of movement by means of thought always makes coarse, kills, and not only by means of thought, but also by sense perception, and not only of movement, but every concept. Characterizing metaphysics, Lenin used some very sharp words: undeveloped, crude, dead, rigid. He referred to metaphysical materialism as stupid compared to clever dialectical idealism. The only antidote against metaphysics, and against dogmatism as a variety of metaphysics, is dialectics, with its requirement of flexibility of thought. True dialectical thought is in a sense the music of the spirit which grasps the finest interplay of the contradictions of life and consciousness, the shadings of opposites, the transition of some phenomena into others, in a word, the movement and becoming of that which is, its reflection in the logic of concepts. Dialectics brooks no stagnation and imposes no constraints on knowledge and its potential. Dissatisfaction with that which has been attained is its element, and revolutionary activeness its essence. For dialectical philosophy, nothing is final, absolute, sacred. It reveals the transitory character of everything and in everything. Nothing can endure against it except the uninterrupted process of becoming and passing away, of ascending without end from the lower to the higher. Dialectics is a creative theory inconceivable without constant development and enrichment. The pledge of such enrichment and development is unity with a historically developing social practice, with the needs of science and culture. Estrangement from real life, escape into pure theory results as a rule in scholasticism and metaphysics as the antipode of dialectics. To be an effective theory of the cognition and transformation of the world, materialist dialectics constantly processes new social practices, assimilating the living experiences of historical activity, and thus receiving new impulses for development towards perfection. This is a necessary condition of its viability. What does the connection between dialectics and real, practical life mean in real terms? On the theoretical plane, this connection means that the general philosophical materialist principle of hysterism is applied to dialectics itself. None of its results are accepted as ready-made, final and immutable. Dialectics must demonstrate flexible thinking, reflecting in cognition all the real twists and turns of the object's movement. Only in this case can cognition fulfill its primary task of being concrete. Materialist dialectics is expressed in a system of philosophical principles. categories and laws which are a means of understanding reality in all its essential forms of manifestation, in nature, society, and thought itself. Dialectical principles underlie the elaboration of a contemporary natural scientific picture of the world. For instance, 1 F. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy, in K. Marx, F. Engels, Collected Works, Volume 26. Progress Publishers, Moscow, 1990. Page 360. Physics has got rid of the metaphysical notion of eternally existing simple particles of matter. Having established that elementary particles are born and disappear, going through various transformations, the construction of a socio-historical picture of the world is also impossible without dialectics. It is dialectics that helps us to form a clear picture of the mechanism and character of the motive forces of social progress. On the dialectical materialist approach to analysis of the facts of nature, social life and consciousness, it is possible to determine the laws of their development and scientifically predict the future, discovering real and rational methods of building that future. Chapter 2: An Outline History of Philosophy. 1. A history of pre-Marxian philosophy. Each epoch in the life of mankind raised its own philosophical problems, and solved them in its own way, while retaining a certain measure of continuity. Any newly emerging system rejected, in some degree or other, all the previous ones. The history of philosophy can be likened to the growth of a quaint-looking tree, with constantly multiplying branches, each branch having form and color entirely different from the others. Also, the branches of philosophical